heard, I am a sociologist by training, and so this portion of the presentation will be on a historical context and a framework, setting up a framework. When I come back at the end, the second half, I will talk about both my parents' experiences, who were both survivors of the Holocaust, with important stories. So the framework I want to start with is the one that Bill mentioned, is looking at the cast of characters as perpetrators, victims, bystanders, and heroes. And perhaps in that we will also be able to continue to answer the questions that were asked. And this frankly drove me. I always wondered why educated people would go along with mass murder. After all, the war began, at least from the Holocaust point of view, in Germany, where people were educated. And we often say education is the key to making sure it doesn't happen again. And yet it was in an advanced industrial society is exactly where it began. So we'll start with who are the perpetrators. So Ina, if you would go to the slides. Okay, next. Next. Okay, thank you. That's next. Okay, so now I'm just going to do, because I know these pictures are you're well acquainted with this cast of characters, but as a retired professor, I wanted to highlight some of these cast of characters, villains, and I also thought it would be more interesting to look at a rapid series of slides as opposed to just listening to me, because having great oration skills and speaking after Bill is not easy. So we start with Adolf Hitler, who I want to point out was elected, and he was the Chancellor of Germany, and he actually issued laws and decrees without consulting the legislature, because after he was elected, he declared himself Führer for life. Next, please. Next slide. Heinrich Himmler was the leader of the SS, a special security unit within the Nazi Party, and he controlled the concentration camps, factories, and businesses. Next, please. Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, was the German Air Force. He was a leading advocate of Aryanization and the confiscation of Jewish businesses. We'll get to Aryanization in a few minutes. Next. Joseph Goebbels was the chief propagandist of the Nazi Party and Reich Minister of Propaganda. Next. And I'm sure you've heard of Adolf Eichmann. He was an officer of the Schutzstaffel in charge of implementing the final solution, the deportation of Jews to the death camps. Next. Okay, and so now we look, after we've seen the perpetrators, we can look at the victims. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this famous picture of the little boy in the Warsaw Ghetto with his hands held up, and he's 7 years old. His name was Zvi Nussbaum, and this was in 1943. It was taken by a Nazi photographer, and there are conflicting accounts of whether this boy survived the war or not. But you can see their innocence, and that's the main point. Their only crime was being born Jewish. Next. Here we have more victims. Jews, deportation of Jews from Bielefeld, Germany to the Riga ghetto in Latvia, December 13th, 1941, from the Yad Vashem archives. So, and part of the reason I think people went along is a failure of imagination. Most people did not understand what the final solution was. They didn't talk about the mass extermination of Jews. They thought they were being resettled. They thought that they would work. They thought that they would be able to, eventually the war would be over. But we were all wrong. Next. Now we have people who are bystanders. The question arose, why didn't people stand up to the Nazis? Well, fear. Fear is a huge factor. And when I used to teach a class on the sociology of the Holocaust, I would always say, would you risk your own life and your family's life and everything you know? It's easier to keep your head down and just lie low. So here we have a Jewish man paraded through a street in Vienna in 1938 among a crowd of spectators from the Vienna Holocaust Library collection. Next, please. Now, where were these victims taken to camp, Auschwitz, which also had the Birkenau part. So it says work will make you free. And in Birkenau rather, there were people who were able to survive by working. And my mother happened to have been one of them. And I will tell you more about her later. Next. Okay, this is a less well-known camp. This was the entrance to a death camp. There were no opportunities for work there, called Belzec in Poland near the Ukrainian border. I took this picture in 2001.
Help me.
Excuse me? Okay, I took this picture in 2001. After that, the camp, and there was a monument, and we could spend hours on all of this. Everything was changed. They had a big design competition. They added a museum. And so this no longer exists as it is, although they changed the camp to make it more of a, frankly, tourist attraction. But that's time for another piece. But these were some of the places that the victims were taken to. Next, please. Okay, but there were people who stood up. There was a question about who stood up. So I don't know if you're familiar with Sophie and Hans Scholes. They were the leaders of the White Rose movement. This was in Germany, and they passed out all these leaflets, alerting everyone at great risk to themselves. And they had a small group of people working with them. And they basically said to the people, wake up, do you know what your government is doing in your name? And the short version is they were both murdered for their activities against the state. It's a gripping story. There's a wonderful book called The White Rose by a friend of mine, Judge Tannenbaum, and I urge you to look into the story. In terms of providing hope for people and inspiration, I would say particularly young people, this is a story that there was a movie, but it should be more well known. Next. Next, please. Okay. Some of the well-known people who did take a stand, and again, I don't have time to talk about all of them. Raoul Wallenberg. Next, please. The Swedish diplomat, Oskar Schindler, who I'm sure you all know from the famous movie. Chiunu Sugihara, who was a diplomat in Japan, who stood up for the Jewish people. And then there were, next please, then there were the people that we don't know, the American army, the Russian army, and individuals who were later termed righteous Christians. So next please. I have here General
Yes,
Dwight Eisenhower, a leader of the American forces. Next.
yeah, there. What?
Next please. Okay, and this is someone that many, Marshal Georgy Zhukov became a symbol of national strength, the most widely esteemed Soviet military hero of World War II. He successfully led several major, there's someone in the back, led several major.
Hold a second, please. Somebody mute your microphone, please. Okay. Thank you.
He successfully led several major offenses, including the defense of Moscow in 1941 and the pivotal Battle of Stalingrad in 1942 to 43. He became the highest ranking military professional who was also a member of the Presidium of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. He and General Eisenhower worked well together. And one of the things that, many things that our students do not know, and most, is that Russia and the United States were allies during World War II. So, and that's something that is not talked about because I guess it's not politically correct these days. Okay, next. Next. Okay, two righteous Christians that I know you haven't heard of are Witold Monchak and Helga Futowska. And you'll hear about them more in the last part, but both of them helped my parents survive. And so we were able to get them nominated as righteous Christians from Yad Vashem, and I'll go into details later on. Next. Okay, so now that we know the range of characters, we can go into the historical context. And in terms of the historical context, anti-Semitism has gone on for thousands of years. So it's always difficult to say, let's start here. But I'm going to start with the Dreyfus Affair. I'm sure Alfred Dreyfus, this is a story that took place in France, an event, and Émile Zola stood up for him and wrote a very famous article called Je accuse. I accuse the government of doing all these things that are really anti-French. And it was a long, arduous event. And again, movies have been made about this. This took place between 1894 and 1906. And ultimately, he was acquitted. He was not a spy for Germany. As a Jewish man, an officer, he was accused of being a spy for Germany, which was not true. And ultimately, that was proven. The outcome of that, there are two, I think, important things to recognize, is that it had a big influence on Theodor Herzl, who at that point realized that Jews needed a homeland of their own. And so that the Dreyfus affair is what sparked that interest in him. And so here we have Captain Alfred Dreyfus and what happened to him. The other thing is that there was, in terms of the Dreyfus affair, was the idea of the separation of church and state, which we can get into later on. Next, please. Okay, the Treaty of Versailles, again, end of World War I, clearly led up to World War II in many ways, because the treaty was signed on June 28, 1919, but imposed very harsh terms in Germany. Territorial changes, Germany had to give up Alsace-Lorraine back to France, East Prussia and Upper Silesia went to Poland, its colonies went to the League of Nations. The military restrictions were onerous, conscription was banned. I think you can read the slide. Its army was limited to 100,000 men, and the Navy was restricted in the size and scope of vessels. I think one of the biggest issues was the war guilt clause. Germany was forced to accept full responsibility for the war. A provision is known as the war guilt clause, Article 231. And again, the economic consequences, reparations. Germany was required to pay substantial reparations to the Allied powers for the damage caused by the war, a sum that would later prove unsustainable and led to hyperinflation and social unrest. And finally, the League of Nations, which was the forerunner to the United Nations, was supposed to stop the wars, but the United States did not sign on because the Senate did not ratify it. So we can go on from there. Each of these slides, each of these topics, we can spend hours on. We move on to Kristallnacht, which is many people look at as the beginning of the Holocaust. And that is Kristallnacht, being the night of broken glass, occurred between November 9th and 10th. That should have been 1938, not 1038. Sorry about the typo. Okay, it occurred not in Germany, Nazi-occupied Austria, and the areas of the German-occupied Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, because of anti-Semitism. Now they have the proximate cause, which was that Herschel Greenspan, who was a Jewish man, left his own home, ended up, I believe it was France, if I recall correctly, and he assassinated a German diplomat, Ernest von Rath. So this was considered reparations, if you will, payback for the murder of Ernest von Rath. And so the government ordered a pogrom, looting, arson, mass murder, state terrorism, and basically you had the perpetrators and the bystanders. So I have some photos of that. So we'll go next. We have a picture of Herschel Greenspan and the diplomat he murdered, Ernest von Rath. Next. And of course, at that point, Jews had to have all their stores marked as Jews, and people had to start wearing yellow armbands. You'll hear about that in a minute, and the Jewish stores. And then it was the night of the broken glass. That's why you have the notion of crystal. Next. The synagogues were set on fire, and there was nothing anyone could do. And then from there, we have the deportation of Jews. The real issue, if you think about it, was the perfect storm. It was the police turned their backs on the violence that was occurring, and the Jews were not protected. The laws did not apply to them. And so you have, I'll say, the miseducation of the indoctrination to children in schools, German children in schools. We'll hear a little more about that in a minute. You have the intelligentsia turning against the Jews. In other words, anti-Semitism is always there, but at certain points it comes out of the shadows and it arises, and it becomes a huge flame, as it did. So where did these Jews, where did they end up going? As you'll see, I'll show you some pictures to the various concentration camps. Okay, I think at this point, we're going to go to the Nuremberg laws. Okay, and that was passed in Germany on September 15th, 1935. And their aim was to separate superior German Aryan race from inferior races, which include blacks, it include the Sinti, Roma, the Gypsies, and especially was geared towards Jews. And the Reich citizenship law said that only racially pure Germans should be allowed to hold German citizenship and have political rights. Consequently, Jews, who we're focusing on right now, had no more rights in the German homeland. And then there was the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, a law against race mixing or race defilement, or Rassenschande, to protect the purity of the German race. So now what's interesting to me is that the definition of anti-Semitism in Jews, I mean, there have been various excuses given, if you will, but this was the idea that Jews were a separate race. And that continues to some degree. Next. Okay, I think at this point in time, I'm going to turn it back to Ina, because I will use the remaining slides to talk about my parents' experiences. So we'll start with this slide when I come back. So thank you, Ina, and I'll be happy to take any questions.